Today's lecture is on the Middle East and the nations of the Balkan region. We're going to start our lecture in the Middle East, and as you can see from the map, there are quite a few countries in this lecture. Obviously, we're not going to be able to visit all of them individually. We'll be focusing a little bit more on the commonalities of the region, and there are quite a few of them in terms of food and religion and worldview. And later in the lecture, we will visit the Balkan countries. So, though the majority of Middle Eastern countries, that big map I just showed you, are fairly similar, we're going to talk about some of the differences here, and we'll be elaborating on some of those as we go through the lecture here. But that huge group of countries, the vast majority of them are primarily Muslim. They are followers of Islam. And that actually dictates a lot of their cultural customs, although they're interpreted differently depending on where you are. So if we look at this list that I have here, just illustrating some of the differences, you'll remember from the religion lecture we talked about different varieties of Islam. And the ones that we see most often are the Shia. People that follow this sect are referred to as Shiites. And Sunni is the other one. Throughout the Middle East, Shia and Sunni Muslims are the ones that we see primarily. And we'll talk a little bit more about immigration trends between these two groups in a little bit. Types of government is really different. We've got everything from democratically elected governments, for example, in Israel and some other nations, versus monarchies. Saudi Arabia is an example of a monarchy where power is passed down through families rather than publicly elected officials. We've got countries that have very few minority groups. They have a very homogeneous culture in terms of ethnicity. Again, we see that in Saudi Arabia. I don't see a whole lot of mixing there. And then there are other countries where there's a very diverse cultural population. Places like Lebanon and Turkey, for example, we see a lot of mixing. And of course, that brings a lot of different traditions into these countries. Some of them are very highly modern. Many of the Gulf countries, like Kuwait, are very focused on technology and science. And then there are others, such as Yemen, that still has, semi-nomadic culture, very rural, very rural populations that tend to live in the desert and as I said, are somewhat nomadic. The rights of women can be very different depending on where you are. So, some places where women are very visible, you see them in politics and you see them out and about. Turkey is a good example of that, and certainly Israel is a good example, versus places where women are very tightly controlled and don't have nearly as many rights and are even treated as property in some cases. And we see that in places like Saudi Arabia, although that seems to be changing a little bit with the difference in rulers in Saudi Arabia. Women are finally apparently getting the right to drive themselves around in cars, and maybe not needing male chaperoning everywhere that they go. So we'll see how that goes. Some of them are very secular, meaning that while they are religious, it doesn't drive the society quite as much. It's not a major force in government and politics. Whereas some other states, Iran, for example, is officially there's an official religion, official state religion, which of course is Islam. And so those are sometimes referred to as theocracies, meaning that the state is ruled by the religion, and that's how they make their rules. And then finally, Arabic versus non-Arabic. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into the lecture, but people who are considered to be Arabs are designated that way because of the language they speak. They speak Arabic. And not all the people in the Middle East are Arabic. They speak different languages. So the vast majority of people that live in the Middle East are considered Arabic because they speak Arab. But there are some exceptions, such as Iran. They are not considered Arabic because they don't speak Arabic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So turning our attention to immigration to the United States, we find that immigrants from this part of the world had sort of the same treatment as people from other parts of the world, where coming into the country they were just sort of misclassified as far as where they're coming from. So it's hard to have a good record of where in the world many of these folks are coming from. For example, until 1900, all immigrants of Middle Eastern origin were called Egyptians. And so, again, we have no idea where they really came from. That's just what they did at the time. In later years, there was a little bit more breakdown, but the categories that we had were Syrians or people of Turkic origin from Asia. It wasn't really until the 1930s that there were classifications that clarified a lot of, you know, where these people were actually coming from. And by then, quite a bit of immigration from this part of the world had already taken place. So we're missing a lot of that data. For the most part, in the very early 20th century, the very early 1900s, the majority of people coming from the Middle East into this country were coming, like so many others, for economic opportunity. And, you know, we tend to think of the Middle East as very heavily Muslim, which of course it is, but there are significant populations of Christians in and among these groups as well. And we saw a big influx of Christians coming into the United States, you know, in this early 1900s. And because they were Christian, they tended to blend in pretty well with mainstream Americans, because certainly they had that in common with the majority culture Americans, of course being Christian. We did see some Muslims come in during this time, but significantly smaller amounts than we saw of Christians. And for the most part, these people came in and settled in the Midwest and the upper Midwest, and some were in New England, and they tended to gravitate toward manufacturing and jobs in you know, in those sectors. A lot of manufacturing, a lot of you know, we saw them in later years in car manufacturing and wire making and those sorts of things. And we still see significant populations of people of Middle Eastern origin in the upper Midwest, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. However, since 9/11, as we all know, immigration of people from the Middle East has been a lot more difficult, and it hasn't been unusual for people who are of Middle Eastern descent to try to lay low, especially during times where conflicts come up with Muslim nations, you know, in the United States and in the rest of the world. So a lot more difficult now than it has been in years past. The next major influx of people coming to the United States from the Middle East came right after World War II, when the state of Israel was established. And in that case, it was Palestinians, many of them Christian, suddenly being without a state. And so they needed some place to go, and many of them came to the United States. After that, during the late 1970s, specifically 78 and 79, came the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And what happened there was 2,500 years of monarchic rule was overthrown in favor of the establishment of an Islamic republic led by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And this was a tremendous upheaval for the people of Iran. And as we've learned in other parts of the course, whenever there's tremendous political or economic or civil upheaval going on in one part of the world, people leave. And many times they come to the United States, and that certainly was the case here. And as we've seen also in other parts of this course, the people that leave first are the ones that have education, and they have the financial ability and resources to leave easily and go somewhere else. And that's certainly what happened. So the majority of Iranians coming into the United States during that time were physicians and professionals and scientists. And so we haven't seen that influx from the Middle East of people that are that educated since this time. So, and generally once they come to the United States, these people generally assimilate pretty well because they have the education to help them do that. The picture that you see on this slide is from the Iranian hostage crisis, and many of you probably are not old enough to remember this, but it happened during the Islamic Revolution, where many hostages were taken from the American embassy in Tehran during this time, and held by many of them were Iranian students, Iranian university students. They were held for more than a year, and in protest of the United States. Fortunately, they were all released. There were no deaths as a result of it, but it was a major news story during that time. One of the results of the attacks on the United States in September of 2001 is that many people of Arab or Middle Eastern descent are a little more likely to not advertise their ancestry for fear of discrimination. And so that can make it more difficult to count this population. The attacks happened, of course, in the year 2001, and the last census that we had was in 2010. And the next one is due in 2020, and so we can see what the data looks like at that point. But groups that are controversial tend to hide from the census, and so the counts may not be representative of who's actually here. Despite that, we know that people from the Middle East are one of the fastest growing cultural groups in the United States. And in particular, those who are Muslim have jumped quite a bit. We know that of people that are coming from the Middle East in 1970, about 15% of those practice Islam. And that's compared, if you compare that to the census in the year 2000, 73% of the people coming from the Middle East indicated that they are Muslim. So again, in 2020, it'll be interesting to see what that looks like. As I talked about in some of the previous slides, the term Arab is generally reserved for people who speak Arabic, so it's linked to the language. And also, as I mentioned, not everybody who lives in the Middle East is considered Arab because of language differences. The vast majority of Arabs, as we mentioned, have settled in New York and throughout the Midwest, particularly the upper Midwest. Detroit, Michigan has the largest concentration of Muslims in the United States. So Dearborn, Michigan in particular has a very large population, and you'll actually find the largest mosque in the United States in Dearborn, Michigan. And I have a picture of that in a few slides so we can see that. But the vast majority of Arabs have settled in these areas. Non-Arab populations coming from the Middle East are from Israel, Turkey, and Iran. So people from these areas don't speak Arabic. The Iranians, as we talked about a few slides ago, many of them coming during the Islamic Revolution, the vast majority of them settled in Southern California, and Los Angeles in particular. And so we find that roughly 2/3 of the estimated 1 million Iranians live in and around Los Angeles. They speak Farsi, that's the name of their language. And they also refer to themselves as Persian. So that's an older term, but somebody identifies as Persian. That means that they are from or have ancestry in Iran. As I mentioned in a previous slide, the first people that left Iran during the Islamic Revolution were very well educated and professional. So many of them came to the United States and were very easily able to establish themselves, and they've done economically very well. Israelis are generally of European heritage, and Israelis coming to the United States have come very frequently for economic opportunity. And again, many Israelis coming here are very well educated and tend to do pretty well economically when they get here. And they tend to assimilate fairly easily, probably because they are Caucasian many times, and so it's a little easier for them to blend with majority American culture. Despite the fact that the majority of immigrants coming to the United States from the Middle East nowadays are Muslim, in fact, the majority of early immigrants to the U.S. were Christians. And in particular, they were members of the Eastern Orthodox churches. So if you remember from the religion lecture, there was an Eastern Orthodox that broke off from Catholicism. This church in particular that many of these Christians were members of is the Egyptian Coptic Church. Anytime you see the word Coptic, it refers to Egypt. And it's a very old sect. It traces its roots to Saint Mark, and the religion itself was founded in 42 AD, so not too terribly long after the traditional death of Jesus. As we mentioned, the majority of immigrants these days coming from the Middle Eastern and the Arab world increasingly are Sunni Muslim. So if you remember, we had the different sects of Islam, with the majority being either Shiites or Sunni. The majority coming to the United States are Sunni. And we see that the majority of Muslims coming from Turkey tend to be Sunni, and again from most of the Middle East. Iran, we see more that belong to the Shiite sect, and there are some other religious minorities, including the Baha'i faith, which is an offshoot of Islam. And of course, immigrants that are coming from Israel tend to be Jewish. And so, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, this is the picture of the largest mosque in the United States, which is located in Dearborn, Michigan, which of course has a very large Muslim population. The worldview of people coming from the Middle East in terms of family is that very traditional gender roles are valued, and meaning that families tend to be very patriarchal. And in Islam in particular, it is very important that all members of the family, particularly women, are meant to uphold the honor of the family. So if any of the members of the family bring shame upon the family, that is a punishable offense. For many Middle Eastern families, the well-being of the group is much more important than the will of an individual. So, and we see this in many other parts of the world where the entire group behaves in such a way that it benefits the entire group, the entire family. It brings honor upon the family if everybody is acting in a respectable way. It's also not uncommon for people of Middle Eastern origin to live in large family groups, and so family compounds or neighborhoods or even households, you might see several generations living together. Although once they move to the United States, it's not unusual, especially as with subsequent generations, to see them fall more into the mainstream American tradition of sort of a nuclear family where families live separately with their children. Traditionally, marriages were arranged, and that was for the benefit of the family. So it might have been for kinship or for business purposes to bring families together. As with many ethnicities, it is encouraged or has been encouraged for children to marry within their own cultural group. Although, again, upon moving to the United States and subsequent generations, younger generations tend to adhere less to this, particularly the longer they've been in the United States. A woman's purity is very important, and so that's one of the ways that a woman brings honor to her family by remaining chaste or pure, I guess, is another way we could put that, until she is married. Interestingly, the Quran, which we talked about in the religion lecture, of course, the Quran being the holy book of Islam, states that men and women are equal. However, they have different responsibilities, and so that the Quran outlines those traditional gender roles where the woman is really in charge of concerns of family and children and the home, and the men are the economic providers, and so that's something that we see reflected in families of the Middle East and immigrants to this country even today. If we turn our attention to traditional health practices, like many other regions of the world, things like keeping clean, having good diet, getting enough sleep, those are all seen as ways to maintain your health. Despite the fact that Islam generally frowns upon superstitions and many of the things that go into folk medicine, it's still very much practiced. In fact, we see in all throughout the Middle East that many people believe in um, humoral medicine, so meaning the balance of hot and cold, as we've seen in other cultures, keeping things in balance. Um, Wind or air or in other aspects of superstition, such as negative spirits or things like that. Those things can be thought to cause illness. Women, in particular, after they've given birth and the baby for a period of several days, they take special care to avoid anything that might subject them to wind. And so bathing is something within 10 days of birth that is frequently seen as particularly dangerous, and so they tend to avoid that. As with many other areas of the world, we see a lot of herbal medicine used. So things like pomegranate seeds, nigella seeds, garlic, thyme, honey. Although honey's not really an herb, but it's something that they used for antibiotic properties on open wounds, which tends to work pretty well. And the other thing that I have there is the asafoetida plant, and you can see that in the picture. The thing about asafoetida is it smells really, really bad. It's a horrible smelling plant. But there are places in the world where they actually use it in cuisine, as well as herbal medicine. It's used for colds and fevers and things like that. But when you cook it, it's something that it smells really bad, but when you cook it down, it actually it's kind of reminiscent of onions, like cooked onions, and it provides actually a really nice flavor to dishes. And so it's one of those things that it's sort of a mystery ingredient. It's like, this tastes really good, what's in here? And you have this horribly stinky herb that has been used. So yeah, secret ingredient. So continuing with folk remedies, cupping is something that is native to this area of the world, and it's something that we've seen a resurgence of. I think there's a lot of Hollywood celebrities that do cupping. The idea behind it is that you take these glass cups and you put them on certain parts of the body, and there's a flame that's lit in them to create a vacuum, and then it's put on the skin. And what happens is the skin gets pulled up into the cup, and the idea behind it is that it's supposed to increase the circulation in the area. So if more blood is needed in a particular area for whatever reason, the cupping will accomplish that. The other idea behind it, as far as the Islamic world is concerned, is that the idea is that it also helps to rebalance the humors. And so if you're too hot or you're too cold, it'll help balance you out. Sometimes bloodletting is also part of this process, and so slits and cuts are made in the skin to help draw blood out to assist in the process. Cauterization is another practice that the idea behind that is that it can help purify the body. Cauterization is essentially burning. So you're putting a very hot metal rod or a brand, essentially, and you're heating it up and you're branding the skin with it. This has also been used to help disinfect wounds in some cases. So obviously, if you've got an open wound and there's a risk of bacteria growing in it, burning that off is helpful. It doesn't sound like a particularly fun experience to me, but that's one of the ways that it's been used. And of course, honey is also used for open wounds for antibacterial properties. But in cauterization, the injury to the skin is immediately treated with poultices. And so, poultices again are just sort of a mixture of different herbal ingredients that are put into a bundle and then placed on the skin to do whatever needs to be done, whatever balancing of humors or treatment of injury needs to be done at that point. From an environmental standpoint, a lot of the Middle East has the same sort of climate. Much of it is really sort of an arid desert area, which isn't really suited for agriculture. But there are certain parts of it, and in particular the area that has been referred to as the Fertile Crescent, which is what you can see in the slide here, because it's rich with water. There's lots of rivers running through there. Where you have water, you can grow food. And many of the foods that are indigenous to this area are used today. So things like wheat and olives and dates to this day are still very commonly used throughout the area. So we know that, as we've mentioned in this class previously, wherever it's been easy for food to grow, that's where populations and civilizations tend to develop. So there's that transition from being a nomadic population going around having to forage and hunt for your food to getting to a place where you have natural irrigation in the form of rivers, and so you can settle down and grow ample food, and the population tends to grow, which is what happened in this area. So this is referred to as Mesopotamia, which translates to the land between the rivers, is really what it is. And as I mentioned, the Fertile Crescent. There is evidence of this land in this area being farmed as early as 9000 BC, so it's very old, and it occupies the place of modern-day Iraq. So crops such as wheat and barley were eventually farmed here. Pomegranates are something that we see in the area, and pistachios, and again, these are all ingredients that we still see in Middle Eastern cuisine to this day. This is also the land of beer, where you have grain. Humans have always figured out a way to ferment that and make some sort of alcoholic beverage out of it, and Mesopotamia is no different, and on into Egypt. Beer is a very popular beverage, a little different than the brews that we have today, but the idea is the same, fermented grains. Sheep, very common in this area and slaughtered for meat, and so that's a very common meat throughout the area. And then other foods were ultimately introduced from other parts of the world and ended up growing very well here and became part of the dietary mix. And so those are things that included rice, which came from the Far East, and chickpeas and lemons figure really prominently in the cuisine here as well. We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the Balkans, but one of the things about this particular region is that it's a heavily traveled area between Europe and Asia and even Africa. And when you have an area that was within a trade route in antiquity, what tends to happen is that because lots of ingredients are moving back and forth through the area, some end up retained in the area and become part of the cuisine. And so that's certainly true of some herbs and spices that came from other parts of the world. And we see that that theme repeated as we get up into the Balkan nations. So let's switch our attention to the actual food and dietary habits of the region, and we'll start with the core foods. When we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about bread. Very frequently, flatbreads are real common. So things like pita bread, you see very frequently in this area. Rice, pilafs are really common. So pilaf is really a cooking technique. And in the case of the Middle East, they always use long grain rices, very long grain white rice, and it's cooked in fat and it's toasted up, and many times it has additional ingredients like dried apricots and meats and things like that. The slide that you see on here is a dish called tadig, which is Iranian, although there are variations in other regions of the Middle East. And essentially what that is, it's just the rice is cooked until it's got kind of a crunchy toasted crust, and then served that way. You see a lot of pies, turnovers, things that have fillings in them. They might be meat, they might be fruit. Throughout this area, sanbusak is an example of that. And then other grains, wheat, of course, is a major grain in the area because it grows there very well. And so wheat bulgur, in addition to the breads that are made from wheat flour. Bulgur is a wheat kernel that's been cooked and steamed and then dried out and then eventually rehydrated. And that's used to make tabbouleh. So if you've ever had that, that's sort of a salad that's made with these steamed kernels of wheat, and it's mixed with lemon juice and parsley and garlic and tomatoes and all kinds of other ingredients, which are really delicious. For secondary foods, which again, secondary foods are very common in the diet, but not necessarily eaten every single day. Throughout the Middle East, legumes are extremely common, and in some cases may be eaten every day. In particular, chickpeas and lentils and fava beans are really, really common, and we see them very often throughout the Middle East. Chickpeas in the form of hummus. Hummus has become very popular here in the United States. Falafel, which is a chickpea patty. Fava beans, we see those a lot in Egypt in particular. Their national dish, ful madam, is made of mashed fava beans. And then lentils throughout the area. Lentils, of course, are native to the area, and so they make up quite a bit of the diet. So these are actually very healthy ingredients, and very common in many of the dishes throughout the region. Olives, we see very frequently. Many of these items are cooked with olive oil, olives themselves, and the olives are thought to have come from Greece, so not too far away from this area, but they happen to grow well, so particularly the closer you get to the Mediterranean. So those have become very common ingredients. Eggplant, tomatoes, onions, garlic figure prominently in the cuisine. As far as dairy products go, yogurt is very common. And generally we're talking about full-fat yogurt and cheese that's made from the milk of animals that are common in the area. So goat milk, sheep milk, and camel milk are much more common than cow's milk in this part of the world. Cheeses such as feta are made from these types of milks and figure prominently in the cuisine. Fruits, we are talking about fruits that, again, are real common in this area of the world. And so dates are really common. You see the picture there of the date palm. Dates are extremely sweet. If you've never tried them, they're extremely sweet, and they have kind of a caramely flavor to them. But of course, the date palm is native to this area, so those are really common. Pomegranates we see used very heavily in Iranian dishes. Pomegranates and pomegranate juice. Figs, real common in this area. Apricot, melons, those sorts of things all figure very prominently in the cuisine as well. Overall, the cuisine of the Middle East can be broken up broadly into three major culinary areas, all using the same ingredients that we talked about. They're just using them in different ways. So the three areas are Greek and Turkish, that's a little bit more on the western end, Iranian or Persian, and then Arabic. So let's go ahead and examine each one of those. So Greek and Turkish cuisine of all of the categories tends to be the most meat heavy, and lamb is the most common meat that you see here. Fish and seafood, of course, are also real common. Of course, if you look at Greece and the countries that are in and around the Mediterranean, seafood is very available. They tend to use flatware instead of finger foods. That's real common. And then lots of fresh salads are also figure prominently in the cuisines. And so we see lots of greens, lots of olives, and particular lemon juice and lemon juice infused sauces are really common. Olive oil is used very liberally as well. Greeks tend to favor pastries. Turks tend to favor rich custards and candy. And a lot of the cuisine in this area is defined by religion. Christian versus Muslim dietary rules dictate things like fasting and when to eat, when not to eat, and what sorts of foods to eat at particular times. We see some differences, but we also see some overlap between Eastern Orthodox, such as Greek Orthodox, and Muslim religions as well. So Arabic cuisine is a little more rooted in the nomadic culture that was present for much of the early civilization, and featured some of the ingredients that grew very well in the areas, as we previously talked about. It's much less meat-based and more legume-based than the Greek and Turkish diet. So when we talk about legumes, again, we're talking about primarily the chickpeas and the fava beans and lentils. They figure real prominently here. Also a lot of grains. So the kibbeh is a dish made with cracked wheat. You know, we talked about bulgur. It's mixed with onion and lamb and some herbs. Ful madam, which is the picture that you see here on the slide, that's considered the national dish of Egypt. And I guess it's sort of like hummus, where it's just kind of ground up fava beans that have different herbs and spices put into them, and served with flatbread real commonly. And flatbread is something that we see across the board because wheat is something that grows very well in the area. Flatbreads are extremely common, and generally you see them with most dishes. You also see a wide variety of variety meats. And when I say variety meats, I'm talking about offal, which is not the muscle meats, but a lot of organ meats and those things. They're particularly good about eating from head to tail on these animals, and so really not letting anything go to waste, because traditionally, if you did that, you could go hungry. Of course, with Arabic cuisine, they don't eat pork, and so pig products aren't something that you're going to see, but other animals such as sheep in particular, you're going to see that very commonly in Arabic cuisine. Some regional variations. Food is a little bit spicier in some parts, such as Syria. And something that you see very commonly is soups and stews, always served with some sort of flatbread. And rice, as we talked about with the pilafs. Tharid is a type of stew that has lamb in it. Typically, it's thickened with torn up bread put into broth, and frequently it has meat such as lamb in there. This dish in particular is thought to have been the favorite dish of the Prophet Muhammad, and is something that's very commonly served throughout the region. Our final cuisine is Persian cuisine, which of the three is really the most inclusive. One of the reasons for that is that the Great Silk Road is something that went through what is now Iran. And if you're not familiar with the Great Silk Road, what it was is a trade route that extended from the Far East, from China in particular, to Europe. And so, as I mentioned a few slides ago, anytime you have a region that was traditionally a trade route, a lot of goods went back and forth through the area, and that always has an effect on the food, because again, ingredients are kept, are pinched from the supply, and enrich the foods along the trade route. So we see in Persian cuisine, we see a lot more spices, in particular curries. You see a lot more different types of rice dishes and teas. One of the things that really defines Persian cuisine is the use of fruit in savory dishes. And what you see there is a dish called fesencun, which is a dish of chicken and herbs, but it's cooked with liberal amounts of pomegranate juice and pomegranate seeds. Pomegranate is something that you see very commonly in Persian cuisine. Just really defines Persian cuisine very well because of that savory sweetness. We'll talk briefly about the Balkan countries. As you can see here on the map, they consist of the areas that are sort of to the west of the Middle East, or the north and the west of the Middle East. And they make up areas that were parts of the Soviet Union, as well as parts of the country known as Yugoslavia, before the breakup of communist regimes in the area. And now they are a series of independent states, and you can see many of them listed here: the former Yugoslavia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, and so on. Those were originally all one country, but they're all separate now. And as we'll see in the next few slides, they are also very much part of the ancient Silk Road routes that came through there. So so much like we saw in Persia with the mixing of ingredients and the introduction of exotic ingredients from both Europe and China, we see a lot of influence in these countries as well on the foods that they eat. Around the turn of the 20th century or the early 1900s, many immigrants came from the Balkan regions for economic opportunity, like so many other groups, and many of them settled in the Midwest. And then right after World War II was when much of the region came under communist rule. And so there were many people that were trying to escape that. And so that stimulated another wave of immigration to the United States. And as happens so many times when you have waves of people coming from a specific region, they come to the United States and they live in areas that have already been established by previous immigrants from the same part of the country. And that's what happened. During the 1990s, there was the Bosnian War, and that was a period where Bosnian peoples, many of whom are Muslim, were being ethnically cleansed from the area. And so it was a rather dark time. There was a lot of genocide that was happening. But many of them flooded into the United States to escape that. And so there was a huge wave of Bosnians coming to the United States, and they settled in several different areas. Right now, St. Louis, Missouri has the largest population of Bosnians. I personally lived in New York, in central New York, for several years. And Utica, New York, which is not too far from where I was an enclave of Bosnian refugees, and so they added a really interesting culture to the area that had been settled so much by Italian and Polish immigrants and their families that have been there for several generations. In terms of family, generally with this group, again, we tend to see the more traditionally defined male-female roles, where the woman rules the house and children and internal matters, and the man provides economic support. Greek in particular, Greeks are very patriarchal. And that honor that we talked about with Middle Eastern families is very important. So again, very important for everybody to act in an honorable way to defend the family and save face in public situations. Everybody's acting honorable and should be worthy of honor and respect. Generally, in terms of religion, this area is either Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. The Greek Orthodox Church is another variety of that Eastern Orthodox complex of churches. And as we talked about Bosnians, many of them are Sunni Muslims. Traditionally, the land that encompasses the Balkans, all the countries, has been really good as far as agriculture is concerned. So a lot of native crops are grown in there. And in large part, a lot of those crops are the same ones that we saw growing in the Fertile Crescent area. So we see a lot of wheat and legumes and things like that. Because of where the Balkans are located, there's a lot of different influences going on there throughout those countries. However, there, the whole territory is fairly similar. You know, despite the fact there are certain different countries there, the same types of dishes tend to be seen over and over again. If you think about the Balkans, where they are, and you can refer back to the map, they're sort of located between the Middle East and Russia and the southern part of the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Greece, and part of it is near the Mediterranean. So when you look at the countries in the Balkans, the culinary influences really come from all of that. The other thing is, as we've mentioned, with parts of the Middle East, the ancient silk routes ran through the area as well. So, you know, there's also this element of spices coming from the Far East and trade with Europe going back and forth. So you mix all that together, you come up with this sort of mix of Eastern European cabbage rolls and Middle Eastern dates and savory fruits and things like that. It just kind of all comes crashing together in the Balkans. Typically, what you're going to find in the Balkans is that whatever the country is that you're looking at, whatever it's closest to is what it tends to favor. So if you're looking in the northern Balkans, you know, you're looking at something like not Bulgaria, like Romania, or you're looking at Serbia or Croatia. Those are going to be more European influenced. Certainly a territory like Croatia is very close to Italy, and so you're going to see some Italian influence, but there's going to be more influence of the types of foods that you would find there. You know, the seafood is on the coast. You're going to see more olive oil, olives, those sorts of things. On the southern part, if you're looking at Greece and Bulgaria and Macedonia and those territories, there's going to be more similarity to the Middle East. And so you're going to see pilafs, and you're going to see spices that are a little bit more reminiscent of the Middle East. And then you're also going to see in some of the territories, like say Romania and also Bulgaria, you're going to see some influences from the former Soviet Union. So things like sour cream and beets and things like that. The other thing to throw in the mix is that in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire, which essentially is Turkey, controlled the entire area. So there's a lot of Turkish influence there as well. So you see that in terms of coffee. Coffee is really important in the area. Things like baklava and sweet pastries and things like that. That's the Turkish influence that's coming through as well. So there's a whole lot going on in the Balkans, and just makes the history all that more interesting. And you see the picture there is Croatian sarma. That's just a cabbage roll that it's a cabbage leaf, which may be fresh, but it also may be pickled. And it's just stuffed with a mixture of meat and rice, and it's served in tomato sauce with some sour cream. This particular dish exists all over the place in the Balkans, and they call it different things depending on where you are, but the idea is pretty much the same. And if you think of other wrapped foods, you know, you think of Greece, they have dolma, which is meat and rice wrapped in grape leaves. And so it's the same idea, it's just different ingredients depending on where you are. So you know, you tend to see very typically the same dish over and over and over again. all throughout this region. It's just called something different, and the ingredients are slightly different depending on where you are, how close you are to Europe, how close you are to the ocean, how close you are to the former Soviet Union, how close you are to the Middle East. And that's probably the best way to describe the food story of the Balkans. And that concludes our lecture.